let's cover the shenanigans with Boris Johnson to begin with. What's it all about? Why has he done this? And why has he done it now?
Well, the most important thing to say about Boris Johnson is that whilst he does lack intelligence, he does lack competence, he is nonetheless a very shrewd politician. His resignation was a tactical one. By resigning, he wants to try and initiate the right of the Conservative Party, the nationalist wing of the Conservative Party, to bring about a vote of no confidence against Theresa May. By bringing about a vote of no confidence against Theresa May, that could lead to a leadership contest whereby Boris Johnson sees his opportunity to stand, and then he could become leader of the Conservative Party and thereby Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So it's very important to establish this, that you will see Mr Johnson back on the Conservative front benches in the near future. His resignation was a tactical one. He is lusting after the job of Prime Minister. He does believe that it is his God-given right to be Prime Minister. No different to David Cameron. David Cameron believed it was his God-given right to be Prime Minister. So Mr Johnson, yes, we can laugh at him, yes, he's been an incompetent Foreign Minister. Certainly I've heard from people in the Foreign Office that they're delighted to see the back of him, but nonetheless don't underestimate him. He's shrewd, he's ruthless, and he has no moral compunction in putting the dagger in people's backs.
But what do you think? I mean, is that actually a positive to the Labour Party, for example, because that will precipitate an election, I'm assuming?
Well,
will that play into Labour's cause?
Well, it would be foolish to say that Labour is not benefiting from this bitter internal arguing within the Conservative Party, and we have seen in the last week or so that the Labour Party have gained at least 2 percentage points in opinion polls. But Labour has said that it is not here to bring down the government. It is here to work with the government to ensure the best Brexit deal for British industry, for British business, and to ensure foreign investment in Britain, and most notably, of course, Chinese investment, Japanese investment, Indian investment. Should all of them, or should even just one of them, withdraw from Britain after March 2019, then the British economy will be in serious trouble. But I do not believe that the Conservative Party will bring about a vote of no confidence in Theresa May. Not because they like her particularly, not because they believe she's a competent, strong leader who's capable of delivering Brexit. No, they're terrified that should there be a new leader, that new leader, to gain legitimacy, because it will be a coronation, will have to go to the country, will have to hold an early general election, and Labour could win. So what I've heard from within the Conservative ranks of Parliament, in particular the more senior ones, they're saying to other Conservative MPs, do you want a Corbyn government? No? Keep your mouths closed.
Very interesting. Trump has just arrived, as we've just seen. We're hearing, of course, that Trump is considering removing himself and his troops from Syria. There's been a degree of consternation, as there has been at every favourable announcement towards the Syrian government by the United States. There's been a reaction from the UK, both from the media, of course, but also from certain politicians. I asked this of Peter Ford yesterday, why is the UK so intent on maintaining the pressure on Syria, in maintaining the military pressure on Syria? What is their objective?
Because historically speaking, and that includes the present day, Britain remains one of the major imperial powers in the world. And of course, the Middle East is its old backyard. And the Middle East is extremely important to the global players in the world, not just for oil, not just for the arms market, but we're talking about access to the Red Sea, we're talking about access to the Persian Gulf, we're talking about access to the Indian Ocean. Why else, for instance, did the British fight for the port of Aden in Yemen in the late 1960s? Because that port is of immense strategic importance. Now, very quickly going back to Mr. Trump and how some people are reporting that he intends to withdraw American forces from Syria. Well, we've heard this in the last year and a half during his presidency. He's done nothing of the sort. Conversely, he's actually increased the amount of American soldiers there. President Assad has been asked that question, and he has said it's total nonsense. The Americans are not going anywhere. And also, are we really going to believe the word of Donald Trump when he has attacked Syria on 2 occasions? Something that Mr. Obama, for all his faults, and I was a bitter opponent of Mr. Obama, at least he did not involve America directly in Syria. Mr. Trump has done that. So when he talks about withdrawing forces from Syria, we need to be extremely cautious. And as always, actions speak louder than words. But let's not forget, that first strike in April 2017 resulted in the deaths of something like 20 Syrian soldiers. Those soldiers are the heart and soul in the fight against Wahhabist terrorism, and Mr. Trump took their lives away. And after he announced that to the world media, he said, quote, "And now I'm going to go back and enjoy my beautiful chocolate fudge cake." And he had just killed 20 Syrian soldiers.
You mentioned Aden. I'd like to come back to Duma and the OPCW report and so on, but let's just go to Aden, because interesting that you mentioned British influence there, because according to sources on the ground in Sana'a, the British are backing Aden and are largely influencing the separatist movement there, unsurprisingly perhaps, because of obviously there's resources in the Red Sea, but also there's the historical context of, I believe it was the WikiLeaks, the oil pipes coming down to the Gulf of Aden to avoid the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Hormuz Straits. For you, what is the historical context of why Britain and America are supporting the Saudi war of aggression, genocidal war of aggression? I mean, this really can be called a genocide. What is happening?
Well, first of all, Saudi Arabia is one of Britain and America's closest allies and friends in the world. There is an immense relationship when it comes to business, when it comes to them buying oil from the Saudis, when it comes to them selling weaponry to the Saudis. But I think also the Americans and the British are concerned about the Saudi-led coalition not emerging victorious in Yemen, and there's a reason for that, and it's just not receiving much publicity. The Americans and the British are aware that through Saudi Arabia they are the dominant outside powers of the Arabian Peninsula, and they're fearful of the domino effect. If Yemen is able to prevail in this extraordinarily brutal Saudi onslaught, and I sincerely hope they do, if they prevail, then Yemen will fall out of the influence of Saudi Arabia and therefore fall out of the influence of America and Britain. Therefore, on the Arabian Peninsula, there will be a country that is not under the indirect control of Washington and London, and they are fearful of that. They've seen what's happened in Syria. The Americans and the British have failed to achieve their objective in Syria, and by trying to overthrow the Syrian government, they have inadvertently brought Russia into Syria, and Russia is now an immensely influential and powerful country again in the Middle East. Now that was a mistake that the British and the Americans made. They didn't want Russia to do that, but because they tried to overthrow the Syrian government, they've done that. So they're fearful that Russia's victory in Syria could be a springboard to other places in the Middle East. Let's not forget, the Soviet Union also had a very close strategic relationship with the old South Yemen. Russia today does maintain those old Soviet-era links in Yemen. The Americans and the British do not want Russian influence on the Arabian Peninsula. They're having to deal with newly found Russian influence in the Middle East. They don't want this to expand to Yemen.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, Russia, quietly, actually, as it tends to do, has been, I believe, at the head of the various UN missions trying to take humanitarian aid into Sana'a in particular.
That's correct.
So again, what we're seeing is while the West is aiding and abetting the destruction, the annihilation of a country, the obliteration of its people, Russia is quietly and without a great fanfare supplying humanitarian aid and support for the Yemeni people.
Yeah.
Contrary to Saudi Arabia and the UN, which is responsible for this blockade through their illegal resolution.
No different to how Russia is providing immense humanitarian assistance to the people of Syria as well. You know, we have the British at the United Nations calling an emergency session about what's happening in the port of Hodeida. Now, to someone who doesn't know how the British official mind works, they would think, well, that just shows the British are passionate, they're civilised. The British approach foreign affairs in a very smart, tactical way. They speak very calmly, very politely, very eloquently. They always remain composed. They always want to be seen as doing everything in accordance with international law. But that disguises their violent objectives and their violent methods. And the British have no moral compunctions whatsoever in using violence to achieve their aims. But we must always remember the British are past masters at deception. Whereas sometimes you can see at the United Nations Security Council, the Russian ambassador there can become very irate, can become very loud. The British never do. The British, in my opinion, are the number one in the world when it comes to PR. And the Americans learn so much from the British about PR. The Americans, they have the muscle. The British, they teach the Americans about PR, about how you come over. And also as well, the Americans are learning from the British about partition. Partition potentially in Syria, but also maybe Yemen. Maybe the British are thinking, well, perhaps there's a large part of Yemen that the Saudis are not going to be able to conquer, but could we potentially partition the region around Aden? And maybe that could be in our sphere of influence. The British partitioned Ireland, they partitioned India, they partitioned Cyprus. They are number one in the world when it comes to partitioning. And I think that in the Foreign Office, in the Ministry of Defence, and in the other corridors of power in Whitehall, they're possibly discussing that option.
Well, and of course, President Hadi, part of his project was to partition Yemen into 6 statelets, with the main Anshrullah stronghold, which was to be called Azal, which would be marooned in the middle without any resources, of course, to sea or to borders. So, very familiar pattern to what we're seeing, or what we're seeing attempted and failing at the moment in Syria. Let's come back to Syria, having kind of gone quickly to Yemen. The recent OPCW interim report, which has effectively discredited the reason for the UK and France and the US to bomb Syria.
The legal
on the
justification.
14th. Absolutely. And you know, this kind of flimsy R2P, right to protect, and pretext that the British government in their internal propaganda put on this attack. Where do they go from here? I mean, how are they going to justify this? We know that the media, of course, has sprung to their defence and is trying to spin it. We saw the BBC producing headlines that they then manicured to be a little more closer to the truth, you know, trying to purport that it was a chlorine attack. But where do they go from here? Because they've effectively broken international law again.
Yes, they have, and they've done that on many occasions, in particular in the last 25 years. And it pains me to say this, Vanessa, but they will keep on doing that. Why? Because they can ignore this report by the OPCW. because there's no spotlight being put on it by British mainstream media. Why? Because British mainstream media is neither free nor independent. It is part, and a crucial part, of the British establishment. The British were exposed over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, the British government, let's be accurate, the British government were exposed. Nothing happened to them. Look, it wasn't so many years later that they went into Libya, and then from Libya into Syria, and we know what they're doing in Yemen as well. So the British government gets away with it because they can get away with it. I remember, Vanessa, in the summer of 2000, a United Nations pathologist team comprised of Spanish doctors went to Kosovo, and they reported that all in all they had found about 2,000 to 2,500 bodies in the ground, and they said the vast majority of these bodies had died in combat and that they were Serb and Albanian. Now, the legal justification for Britain, America and NATO in general bombing Serbia, or as it was then Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, was that the Serbs were committing genocide against the Albanians of Kosovo. I remember, Vanessa, figures being quoted by American media, British media, 500,000 Kosovo and Albanians murdered. Then it was 100,000, then it was 50,000, then it was 25,000. Well, they bombed Serbia, one of the most brutal bombing campaigns in modern military history, where they dropped depleted uranium shells, resulting in a huge increase in cancer rates across the whole of Serbia. I don't know of any Serb who has not lost someone to cancer. But the point is this, is that this UN pathologist report totally contradicted what the British and the American governments and media outlets were saying at the time. Did that deter them from going into Iraq 3 or so years later? No, it didn't. If Britain had an objective, a free and independent media, then the OPCW report, which said there was no sarin used, would be on the front pages of all the newspapers. It would be the first news item, prime time news, 5 p.m, 6 p.m, 9 p.m, 10 p.m, but it wasn't. So unfortunately, even though, you know, the likes of yourself and myself and other people said that it is extremely unlikely that not only does the Syrian government have chemical weapons, but that they would never use them against their own people, it doesn't mean anything in practice when you're talking about Britain, because they're just able to lie and get away with it, and they will keep on getting away with it. We have social media today. Look how much exposure was put on these lies from Washington and London. But they will do it again. And we both know that once the Syrian military focuses its attention solely on liberating Idlib, that's when there will be a real risk of an allegation of chemical weapons being used. It's like Blitzkrieg from World War II. You know what's coming. Sadly, Vanessa, it's extremely effective.
Yeah. So what, I mean, this is a question that I've been asking myself in speaking about media on trial, because where I think is there's a gaping hole in the media reporting. Let's put to one side the fact that they're co-opted and compromised. But where is the emphasis on international law? Because if they were to emphasise that, then to me the whole picture becomes much clearer, and it becomes much harder for them to misreport and misrepresent, omit, etc. I don't know what I'm really asking. Is there any way that we can put the media into a position legally on an international basis where they do have to start to adhere to international norms, to international law, or are they so outside that law?
Theoretically, no, and in practice, no. There is nothing that you can do against them. They are extremely powerful, they are extremely influential, and I think also that even though people like you and I will always emphasise the importance of international law and the United Nations Charter, those two areas mean nothing to the foreign correspondents on these despicable, wretched newspapers like the Times, or the Guardian, or the Daily Telegraph, because their correspondents and columnists, they are ideologically driven foot soldiers of Western global hegemony. They fully subscribe to the concept that the world must be dominated by the West. Yes, they are paid very handsomely for what they say, no question about it. But no one should underestimate their ideological conviction. Their ideological convictions are as strong as your ideological convictions and my ideological convictions. And also they are devoid of morals as well. They have no hesitation in writing something or saying something that they don't necessarily believe is true, but if they feel it helps safeguard American global dominance, they will say it and they will write it. And of course, they care about their bank balances.
One last question. You mentioned the liberation of the South, and I think it was yesterday that the militants or the extremists that are actually surrendered. I mean, I think we can assume to a greater degree that the South has been ignored by the West. They've sort of
lost cause.
Yeah, they've lost cause there. And but as you said, Idlib is a pivotal matter, because that is effectively, apart from the Turkish occupied areas and the northeast, which is still an issue, but we know that Damascus is currently negotiating with the SDF. We know that the tribal factions there have committed themselves to ridding Syria of the US occupation and bringing the SDF factions back to heel.
Yes.
So Idlib is really the next hot point that I can understand. What degree we expect the West to react in a sensationalist, hyperbole manner in the media, etc. We expect that there will probably be a chemical weapon in his hand. What is Turkey going to do? Because huge numbers of those terrorist groups are, of course, under Turkish control, and they're being equipped. They're receiving, millions worth of aid, including from UK aid, of course, that has been running into Idlib through Turkey. So because for Turkey this is quite a major threat, because where do they go? They're going to cross the border into Turkey. So what do you think is Turkey's role going to be in this?
Well, the ongoing campaign by the Syrian military to liberate Daraa will not attract any Western attention, because it's a lost cause.
Yeah.
And likewise, once the Syrian military focus on liberating Quneitra, which is where of course Al-Qaeda and ISIS is, once again that's a lost cause to the Americans and the British. But in the northwest, where you have these loathsome, repulsive Wahhabist terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, FSA. Now that's a different matter. I suspect the Americans and the British, and I strongly suspect this, they will put up a fight for that. Why? Because that is their foothold in Syria. And if the British and the Americans, and in particular the British, if they are putting together a plan to partition Syria, they must retain their presence in the northwest of Syria. Now, in regard to Turkey's position there, well, once the Syrian military turns its attention solely towards liberating the northwest, and that's coming soon, that's in the near future, no doubt there will be a lot of discussions happening in private, political discussions. Will the Turkish soldiers retreat, knowing that they're not going to lose, they're not going to win that fight against the Syrian army? But Turkey has caused so much bloodshed in Syria, and it doesn't seem to me, Vanessa, that they have any inclination to stop that. They are still sending terrorists across the border, terrorists armed to the teeth. So I think there is going to be an almighty battle in Idlib. I don't think you can avert that, and I think And I'm really sad to say this, Vanessa, but many Syrian soldiers will not live to see the day when their homeland is fully liberated. A lot of them are going to die in the campaign to liberate Idlib. But what choice is there? What other choice is there for Syria? Those terrorists in Idlib cannot be rehabilitated. You can't reason. There's no point putting them into prison.
Well, no, because they've already refused amnesty.
Absolutely. And you know more than anyone else what they're capable of doing. So I have no problem in saying that all those terrorist groups there have to be eradicated. And should the Turkish forces there, illegal Turkish forces, if they choose to fight, if Erdogan says, no, we're going to stay and fight, then the Turkish Kurds also have to be eradicated. That is Syrian territory. Will the Turkish soldiers be motivated to fight against the Syrian army on Syrian territory? Well, we just have to wait and see. I'm not so sure about that. I think that if there is a fight between the Syrian army and the Turkish army, that's not a foregone conclusion. I'm not so sure the Turkish public will be happy to see Turkish soldiers coming back in body bags. So the liberation of Idlib is coming. It is absolutely crucial because you have to rid Syria of them. There are some very powerful terrorist formations there. I personally think the most powerful one is al-Nusra. Second after ISIS, but ISIS are virtually a spent force now. But al-Nusra, they're battle hardened. They're absolutely dedicated to their cause and the weaponry they have. Sadly, you know, that they will give the Syrian army a good fight. So whilst they're there, there was always a danger that Syria will be threatened again in the future. And you must ensure that the British and the Americans don't have an influence in Syria, because they could say, no, war over, we're just going to stay in the northwest. Well, Vanessa, what's there to say that in 5 years, 10 years' time, the Americans and the British and the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris will try on again in Syria, and they will have a springboard. They will have a springboard.
Marcus, thank you for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'll let you get out of the
My pleasure.
sun.
Thank you for interviewing me.